this week I cast on this sweater here that I'm working on right now. It is not really looking like much yet, which is partly due to the construction and partly due to me making some modifications to it to keep it portable. Regardless, it is the 𝗙𝗏𝗏 sweater by Anna Elizabeth Anderson. And while I was studying on this, I realized that this is a drop shoulder sweater, and I don't really knit a ton of drop shoulder sweaters. And that made me think about sweater constructions and types of sweater constructions that I enjoy knitting, and I enjoy knitting a little bit less, and what I enjoy wearing and what I don't enjoy wearing. And I started considering what types of constructions I normally knit and what types of constructions are actually in my wardrobe of store-bought items, because drop shoulder is something that is very prominent in my wardrobe. I have a lot of drop shoulder store-bought sweaters, but I don't really knit drop shoulder sweaters a lot. So I thought we could go through the different types of sweater constructions, and I'm going to tell you about how they work, kind of. I'm not really intending for this to be a tutorial, more like an overview, I guess, with the pros and cons, at least that I find, of each of these construction types. I want to start with the drop shoulder just because that's what I'm working on right now and also what I happen to be wearing today. This is my Madeline sweater by Brynhild Larsen. The drop shoulder, as any of these constructions, can be knitted top down and bottom up. Usually I knit basically everything top down, as does everybody, because it's more fun, and also most modern patterns are just written that way. This was actually an item that I knitted bottom up, which is, I guess, a bit unusual and was due to the lace pattern in this. I'm mostly going to be describing how things work top down just because that's what most people are used to by now, and that's also what I've knitted mostly. So for drop shoulder, you focus on the back and the front first, and then you kind of worry about the sleeves later. And the shapes are very simple. It's essentially attaching rectangles to each other, which makes this a very beginner-friendly construction in the sense that it is pretty easy to understand how the sweater happened and how to make the shapes that you need to create the sweater in the end. And it is easy because you make the sweater a little bit too big, essentially. As you might be able to see here, the sleeve starts at this point, even though my arm clearly already starts somewhere over here. So what you do is you make the back panel and the front panel pretty wide, so it falls over your shoulder, which is why it's called a drop shoulder. So this is still my body panel technically, but it is covering my sleeve. And then you pick up stitches for the sleeve later on to knit that down from here. You can obviously make this more complicated than just attaching 4 rectangles to each other. I think most sweater patterns that you will find for drop shoulders have a little bit more shaping to them. Usually this seam that I showed right here will sit further inwards and be closer to the actual curve of your body, and then it will go outwards over here under your arm. That's, I guess, the most popular way these are constructed. I would also say that European shoulder constructions are a subcategory of drop shoulders, at least the ones I've seen, but obviously a lot of these types of sweater constructions merge into one another, and it's sometimes a bit difficult to tell what is one construction and what is another one. For most drop shoulder constructions, you start with the back panel and you cast on stitches in the back of the neck, at least if you're working top down. And since you want the back of your neck to sit a little bit higher than the front usually, just so the sweater is comfortable around the neckline, you can either do that with short rows, so you cast on all of the stitches at first, like I did here, and then you do short rows in the middle. It's not the easiest to show, but I did some short rows in the middle here, and that way that part sits a little bit higher, but you could also do that by just casting on the stitches in the middle and then doing increases along the sides. Both of those work. I think this as the jacket that I have over here is actually an example of what you would call a European shoulder construction. So I also cast on the back panel over here. These are the stitches that I cast on in the middle at the back of the neck. And then this line that you can see over here, this seam, is where I did my increases. So that's where I widened my panel, and then I connected it to the front panel under the arms and later picked up stitches for the sleeve. That's how that was constructed. As you might be able to tell from my descriptions, you have to kind of knit it flat, at least for the most part of the yoke, because you have to leave space for the armhole. You can't like knit it in the round over here and then attach the armhole later. That is, I guess, what you would call steeking, which is also a way to do things, but not what most people would prefer, I assume. So you kind of want to leave an opening, and you will usually achieve that by knitting the back panel flat, and you just knit that until you hit this spot here under the arms where you later want to connect in the round, and then you start on the front panel And the way that is done most commonly is you pick up shoulder stitches over here. So you have this shoulder seam on top of your shoulders where you cast on, and you can just pick up stitches along this line and then knit the front panel down. Normally you will have like 2 separate shoulder sections where you pick up and then you connect them in the front with some cast on stitches to knit the front panel down. And then you can connect them over here, knit the body in the round, and also pick up for the sleeves and knit those in the round. The reason why I don't really enjoy knitting drop shoulders that much from a process perspective is exactly that. I don't think it's overly fun to knit the yoke of the sweater flat. I much prefer constructions where I can knit it in the round. There are a couple of them, and from a process perspective, I do prefer them. However, when I look into my wardrobe, most of my store-bought sweaters are actually drop shoulder sweaters, and I do like the way that they look on me. Obviously, I still knit drop shoulder sweaters, even though I don't prefer knitting the yoke flat. It also does mean that the yoke is usually a little bit easier in the sense that you don't have to do that much thinking. You kind of have to set it up in the beginning, like do the short rows or the increases in the back or pick up for the shoulders. But once you're at this point, where it's really just a rectangular panel, it is very mindless knitting compared to most other yoke constructions. I still think it's a fun construction to do once in a while, and I do like the way the finished object looks, so I think to me that's worth it, and well, it can never hurt to do a little bit of purling just to stay in practice. A construction that is, I guess, almost as easy and beginner friendly, but that I prefer from a process perspective, is a raglan sweater. I have an example over here, which is actually the first ever knitted sweater I cast on, and I also self-drafted this, so you might be able to tell that it can't be overly hard. Basically, for a raglan sweater, if you're knitting it top down, you cast on for the collar over here, which is also something I really like about raglan sweaters, that you can knit the collar already and then have that done and don't have to attach it later like you do with the drop shoulder. Then what you do is you separate your knitting into 4 different pieces. So you keep it all on a round needle, and you find one section that is supposed to be the back, which is this here that you can see right now. You find one section for the front and one section for each sleeve, so you have 4 in total, and you place 4 seam markers, I guess. The seams are a little bit difficult to see with this yarn, but you might be able to tell that the seam runs down here. So this is what it looks like. You end up with a seam that goes from your collar all the way down to your underarm. And the way I knit this is you knit across these stitches on the front, and then you can increase around this seam. So you will increase into the sleeve on one side of the seam and into the front panel here on the other side of the seam. And then you continue knitting over the sleeve. You end up on the other side, and you can once more increase into the sleeve from this side, and then go over the seam, increase into your back panel from the other side, and that you just do all the way around. Obviously, you can play around with the increase rates a little bit, like when you're increasing. For this sweater, this is a very simple one. I think I just increased every other row, and that was about it. I didn't really do any further thinking about it, and since there is some space in here, this has some positive ease, that works all right. You end up with a sweater that will fit you. But obviously you can make some more modifications to this. For example, you can be much more detailed about how you're placing your increases. So for example, when you're looking at my body, you can see that from this point where my collar sits up to this point on my shoulders, I'm not really gaining a lot of yoke depth. This doesn't really sit much higher than this really, but it is much wider. So I'm gaining a lot of stitches over here, but not really much depth. And then from here to here, my body gets a lot longer without getting a lot wider anymore. So what you can do for a raglan is you can place a lot of the increases up here in the first few rounds of the yoke, and then place fewer increases later on, and that creates a seam that follows the line of your body a little bit more closely than this diagonal line that I have in this sweater. I think that's pretty fun to play around with, and I feel like it gives you some more options in terms of ease. For a drop shoulder, you kind of always have to go for positive ease, while for a raglan you can keep this seam very close to your body and therefore make it a little bit tighter. And the main thing that I like about this, obviously, is that you can just knit it on one needle. So you start in the round for the collar, and then you don't really have to do anything except switch to a larger cable until you're done with all of the yoke and you're trying to start the body and the sleeves, because you're knitting both the body part and the sleeve part at the exact same time. So that's kind of a fun thing to do. You do, however, still have to do like a little bit of thinking, because your increase rounds are essentially happening all of the time. As I said, in this sweater that I just showed, I increased every other round. So you mentally have to count your rows all the time. And I find one way to have all of the advantages of a raglan sweater, but less of the counting, is to knit a circular yoke sweater. And that is a construction that I find very underrated. I know a lot of people don't really like it, but it is one of my favorites to knit. And do I have an example here? Of course I do. This is one, and then also this is my lip blouse. That is also one example of a round yoke. As you might be able to tell, it doesn't really have any seams. This one doesn't either. Maybe this is actually a bit easier to show because you can see the pattern more easily. But there's no seams here. You just knit a circle. Essentially, that's what you do. So you can also custom for the collar already. You just knit that in the round. And then instead of placing seams and increasing around those, you'll increase rounds. So what that means is that you select some rounds throughout the yoke where you increase a lot of stitches at once, instead of for the raglan where you increase along the seam, and you can only really increase 8 stitches maximum per round if you're increasing in all of the spots where you could. Whereas here you might start with, let's say, 100 stitches, and then you increase every 4th stitch, and then you have 125. So you have a lot more stitches suddenly. And then you keep knitting for a tiny bit, just a few more rounds, and then you might say, now I'm increasing every 5th stitch. And that way your stitch count grows a lot faster, which means that you have to knit a lot fewer increase rounds. And because it is really only a few rounds where you have to focus on the increases, it makes it a lot easier to have a pattern like this that is very regular, and you can't even really see where the increases were done because they're hidden in the pattern. That is also what I used here, so increasing instead of these petals, and that is how they grow, but also the yoke generally grows. And in the end, you just have a big circle that doesn't really have any defined seams of where your arms or your body is supposed to go. And then you can allocate some of these stitches to your sleeves and some of these stitches to your front and your back, and you can continue knitting in the round for the body and the sleeves. And what I like about that is obviously you're knitting everything in the round, but also you have a lot of mindless knitting in the yoke already. There's not as much focusing going on. Obviously you have an increase round where you need to like really think about it, but then for a few rounds you're like good to go. You're just knitting mostly stockinette in the round, or you're knitting color work in this case. If the yoke doesn't have any seams, it's not as structurally sound, I guess. So a lot of people don't really like the look of circular yokes because they're a bit, I guess, flowy looking. You don't have anything really holding the yoke of the sweater in place or giving your upper body any shape, I guess. You're just in a big circle. I like the way that looks. I feel very comfortable in that. I don't know, but I've heard a lot of people complain that they don't like it, which I kind of get it. It also means that your collar is doing a lot of the heavy lifting of carrying the fabric in a sense. So for the sweaters I just showed, it's kind of fine. Like this one is very lightweight, but this, for example, is knitted out of cotton and linen yarn, and right now I'm also knitting like a cotton sweater, and the yarn is obviously a lot heavier, so it has more potential to stretch out if the only thing that is really holding it up is a collar like this, instead of maybe also a seam over here or a raglan seam. So that is something to keep in mind if you're using a yarn that just is very heavy. And if you're doing that, as I am right now with the other project I have laying around over here, one construction that works very well for that, I find at least, is the saddle shoulder. It's also one of my favorite constructions in terms of the way it looks, and also from, I guess, a knitting process standpoint. So maybe it is just my favorite overall. It looks like this. I don't know how much you can tell. I finished the body, but the sleeves aren't done yet, so you're gonna have to use your imagination a little bit. It also has a lot of ends sticking out of it, but essentially what you do is you cast on up here in the round, which is a good thing to do, I find. And then you create these saddles on the shoulder over here. So you have this rectangular piece. How well can you see that? This rectangular piece that sits on top of your shoulder later on. And it gives the garment a lot more structure. It might also make your shoulder seem a little bit wider, which is why some people don't like this construction. I think it looks flattering on me, so I like doing it. And what you do is you create this seam here for this rectangle by just increasing into the front and into the back, but not increasing into this rectangle at all. So it's kind of similar to a raglan construction, except you only increase into the body and not into the sleeve at first. And then this is what happens. And from there on out, you can really go two routes mainly. The first one would be to knit a drop shoulder from here. So you would just extend the saddle pretty far out. You would keep knitting in the round, only increasing into the front and into the back, and this saddle would sit on your shoulder. For example, you could extend the saddle until over here where my seam of my drop shoulder garment is. So you would have the saddle here, and then you could just bind off the saddle stitches and begin working back and forth for the front panel and the back panel. That would mean you have to knit flat again, and you get some kind of a drop shoulder construction that has a little more structure on top of the shoulder. What I did here is I went into a raglan construction. So the stitches that were my saddle at first then became my sleeve. So I just placed a raglan seam at each end of this rectangular saddle over here. This is what that looks like. And then the saddle became my sleeve essentially. And I'm doing this thing here that I described in the beginning with the raglan sweater, where you don't really knit even increases, but you're kind of spacing them a little bit differently. So over here, I'm only increasing into the sleeve really, and the body or the front and the back panel are staying the same width. I don't know how well you can tell that, but this is the saddle, and then here is where I start increasing into my sleeve. And then a little bit further down, I'm increasing into both the body and the sleeves, and then down here under the arm, I have a short section where I only increase into the body. And well, then I finish the body as you can see, and now I have to pick up the sleeve stitches and finish that. And I think what I like so much about this construction in particular is, well, you can knit it all in the round. There's no knitting flat involved. That is pretty good. You have a lot of structure on top of the shoulder. So for a fabric like this is mostly cotton. That's really nice because it has a lot of seams to hold on to. And then you still have the space to customize this sleeve seam here to fit your body really well. So I think that's pretty fun from a knitting standpoint, but also from a fit standpoint. There's one type of sweater construction I've actually never tried before really, and that is the set-in sleeve. For a set-in sleeve, you shape the armhole that you have on your body panel separately from the shoulder that you have on your sleeve. And that way you can make it fit your body very exact. You can make it very tight to your body, I guess, because you can make it follow this exact line that your body also follows. You could kind of imagine it like this for the drop shoulder, where you leave the armhole open over here so you can later insert the sleeve. Just that the sleeve is shaped a little bit differently. It's not just a rectangle. Most of the time the sleeve is shaped more like a half circle or maybe a trapezoid on top of your shoulder, so it can cover this distance over here and then follow your arm down there. And then it gets a little bit wider under the arm here, so you have, you know, some space to lift your arm and all that. That is a construction that isn't very common, which is, I guess, why I haven't tried it. It is also mostly used in very tight garments, so you can tailor it very well to your body, but most of what I knit is pretty oversized, so I haven't yet come across a pattern that would really need to have a set-in sleeve. There's also some like tweaks you can do with raglans, for example, with what I described earlier, where you sometimes only increase into the sleeve and then you increase into the body, where you can almost mimic that shoulder fit. So it's just not the most popular way to design a sweater, I guess. I would also argue that probably because it is usually used for tighter fitting garments, it is a bit more difficult to write a pattern like that, just because while you can stick to averages for your constructions to some extent, but most people don't have average measurements, so it just becomes pretty difficult to design something with somewhat standard sizing once you go pretty tight, which I guess is one of the main reasons why you see constructions like that pretty rarely. You can obviously seek them out, and maybe at some point I will, just so that I've tried all of them. It doesn't sound as fun because obviously you have to do seaming, but you at least get a very well-fitting garment out of it. So I think that was all of the main sweater construction types. Obviously there's like subtypes in between and modifications you can make to all of them, and obviously you will find a million videos out there of people separating these categories differently from what I did just here. All of that is fine. It all works. You can describe them however you would like. I'm gonna link one series down below by 𝗙𝗛𝗡, which is, I guess, the first one I came across when I started researching this topic, when I began knitting and began self-drafting. So if you would like to learn more in depth about the different types of sweater constructions, more tutorial-like to figure out how to design them and what to pay attention to, then I will send you over there. And for me, I would love to know what your favorite is, if you have favorites. How much of a role the sweater construction plays when you're selecting the patterns you want in it, if that's something you pay attention to, or if you haven't really up until now. I will finish my drop shoulder sweater over here. I mean, I'm done with the part that I dislike doing with all of the knitting flat. Right now it's just knitting in the round. I do have to do some seaming because of the modifications I made, but that's fine. Next week I'll catch you up a little bit more on what exactly I did here and with the other sweater I was showing earlier. That's, I guess, all of my whips at the moment, so you'll hear more about that in my podcast episode, and well, I'll see you next time.